In the quiet mountain town of Cinder Hollow, a retired drifter named Steven Seagal was about to be dragged back into a fight he thought he'd left behind. A slow evening at the local bar turned deadly when a violent biker gang known as the Gravel Fangs stormed inside and shoved a widow to the ground. Steven Seagal wasn't your typical bar patron. For over 20 years, he had served in the shadows of U.S. Black Ops, known for dismantling cartel strongholds without leaving a trace. When the Gravel Fangs threatened an elderly bartender and shattered the town's sense of safety, they had no idea they were picking a fight with a master of silent warfare. Steven unleashed a precise, brutal counterattack that would trigger a reckoning none of them could escape. What began as a night of intimidation became a town's turning point. Cinder Hollow would never be the same after one man decided enough was enough. Before we jump back and tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Hollow taproom sat like a weathered sentinel against the Montana twilight, its amber windows casting warm rectangles of light across the gravel parking lot. Inside, the familiar rhythm of small-town evening life hummed along. The soft click of pool balls, the gentle scrape of chairs, and the low murmur of conversations that had been continuing for decades. Steven Seagal pushed through the heavy oak door, bringing with him a gust of cool mountain air that carried the scent of pine and distant snow. At 63, he moved with the fluid economy of a man who had learned long ago that every motion should serve a purpose. His dark hair, streaked with silver, was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and his weathered leather jacket hung loose over a black t-shirt that had seen better days. "Evening, Steven," called Mara Holt from behind the bar, her voice carrying the easy familiarity of 3 months' worth of shared silences. She was 38, with auburn hair that caught the light and eyes that missed nothing, a quality that had served her well during her years as an EMT before she'd returned to Cinder Hollow to help her aunt run the bar. Steven nodded, a barely perceptible acknowledgement that somehow conveyed both gratitude and respect. He made his way to his usual booth in the corner, the one that offered clear sightlines to both entrances and kept his back to solid wall. Old habits died hard, especially when they'd kept you alive through 2 decades of Black Ops work in places the CIA preferred to forget. "Green tea, same as always?" Mara asked, already reaching for the ceramic pot that sat warming on the back burner. "Please." His voice was quiet, measured, carrying the weight of a man who had learned that words, like actions, should be chosen carefully. Lillian Rhodes emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. At 71, she moved with the grace of someone who had never allowed age to define her limitations. Her silver hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her eyes, the color of winter sky, held the kind of strength that came from weathering storms and emerging intact. "How's the cabin treating you, Steven?" she asked, settling into the routine of checking on her regulars. Behind her, the wall displayed a collection of photographs spanning 4 decades, miners coming off shift, wedding parties, holiday gatherings, and always, somewhere in the frame, her late husband Henry's gentle smile. "It's quiet," Steven replied, accepting the steaming mug from Mara. "Just what I needed." Lillian nodded, understanding in the way that only small-town bartenders could. She'd seen enough souls seeking refuge in the bottom of bottles or the silence of mountain cabins to recognize the signs. Whatever Steven Seagal was running from, or toward, he'd find it in his own time. At the bar, Sheriff Caleb Yates nursed a coffee and reviewed incident reports. At 45, he carried the weight of a town that was slowly changing, where old-fashioned problems were giving way to new complications that kept him awake at night. His deputy, Fiona Kwan, sat across from him, her laptop open as she cross-referenced regional crime patterns with their local incidents. "Drug activities up 12% in the county," Fiona reported, her voice carrying the crisp efficiency of someone who'd traded big city policing for the promise of community connection. "Most of it's passing through, but some of it's starting to stick." "Kids?" Yates asked, though he already knew the answer. "Some, but also organized groups. Bikers, mostly, using the back roads to move product between Denver and Seattle." From his corner booth, Steven's attention sharpened almost imperceptibly. His fingers tightened slightly around his mug, and his eyes tracked to the window, where the last light of day was fading into mountain darkness. Tiberius, Ty, Green hobbled over from the pool table, his wooden leg tapping against the worn floorboards. At 78, he was the bar's unofficial historian, a man who had seen Cinder Hollow transform from a booming mining town to a struggling community clinging to its identity. In my day, he announced to no one in particular, bikers were just boys with loud bikes and too much time. Now they're running drugs and terrorizing decent folks. Times change, Ty, Lillian said gently, but her eyes flickered with something. That might have been concern. Some things shouldn't, he replied, settling onto a bar stool with a grunt. Some things are worth keeping the same. As if summoned by his words, a low rumble drifted through the walls, distant but unmistakable. The sound of motorcycle engines, multiple bikes, growing closer. Steven's cup paused halfway to his lips, and his eyes fixed on the window with laser focus. You expecting anyone? Mara asked, her voice carrying a note of unease that she tried to hide. Not this time of night, Sheriff Yates replied, his hand moving instinctively to his radio. Most folks know better than to ride the passes after dark. The rumble grew louder, more distinct. 5, maybe 6 bikes, Steven estimated. Their engines tuned for power rather than stealth. They were taking their time, circling the building like predators evaluating prey. Shadow, Lillian's black Labrador, rose from his spot by the fireplace and padded to the door, his ears alert and a low growl building in his chest. The dog had been with Lillian since just after Henry's death, found injured near the mining site, where her husband had died, saving 3 of his crew. He'd never shown aggression toward anyone who belonged in the bar. Easy, boy, Lillian murmured, but her hand went to the small gold cross at her throat, a gesture Steven had noticed she made whenever she was nervous. The engines cut abruptly, leaving a silence that felt heavy with possibility. Headlights swept across the windows, harsh and intrusive, before going dark. Car doors slammed. No, Steven corrected himself. Heavy boots on gravel. Multiple sets. Maybe I should see who our visitors are, Sheriff Yates said. But even as he spoke, the front door swung open with enough force to rattle the frame. The temperature in the room seemed to drop as 5 men filled the doorway, their presence sucking the warmth from the air like a sudden draft. They wore leather vests over denim and flannel, their faces weathered by wind and sun and choices that had led them down roads most people avoided. Their leader stepped forward first, a man built like a mountain, with salt and pepper hair and arms that strained against his jacket. The patch on his vest read Gravel Fangs in faded letters, and beneath it, Trey Gravel Maddox, President. Well, Gravel said, his voice carrying the kind of casual menace that came from years of having people step aside when he walked into a room. What do we have here? A real old-fashioned saloon. His eyes swept the room, cataloging faces, exits, and potential threats with the practiced efficiency of a predator. They lingered on Sheriff Yates for a moment, taking in the uniform and the wary expression, before moving on to Steven, who sat perfectly still in his corner booth. Hope you folks don't mind some company, Gravel continued, though his tone made it clear that their preferences were irrelevant. We've been riding hard, and we're mighty thirsty. The 5 men spread out across the bar with the casual confidence of wolves claiming territory. Behind Gravel, his crew moved with practiced coordination. Stitch, Ramirez, a wiry man with scarred knuckles and eyes that darted constantly, looking for angles and weaknesses. Jake, Hammer, Morrison, built like a linebacker gone to seed. Tony Wrench, Castellano, who kept one hand near the knife on his belt. And bringing up the rear, looking uncertain and younger than his 19 years, Eli Mouse Tucker. 5 whiskeys, Gravel announced, not waiting for an invitation to the bar. The good stuff. None of that rotgut, you probably serve the locals. Mara exchanged a glance with Lillian, who nodded almost imperceptibly. In 40 years of running this bar, she'd learned when to pick her battles and when to let things play out. Coming right up, Mara said, her voice steady despite the tension that had settled over the room like a heavy blanket. She reached for the top shelf, her movements deliberate and calm. Stitch sidled up beside her, close enough that she could smell the road dust and stale sweat on his clothes. Pretty little thing like you working in a dump like this, he said, his voice carrying the kind of casual cruelty that came naturally to him. Must get lonely. Not particularly, Mara replied, not looking up from the bottles she was pouring. We've got good people here. Good people, Stitch repeated, his laugh carrying no humor. That's what they all say, right up until the moment they prove otherwise. Meanwhile, Hammer had wandered over to the pool table where two local ranchers, Dave and Pete, were trying to continue their game despite the unwelcome audience. Mind if I play winner? He asked, though his tone suggested it wasn't really a question. We're in the middle of a game, Dave said, his voice carefully neutral. He was a man in his 50s who'd spent his life working cattle and avoiding trouble, but there was steel in his voice. Well, now you're at the end of it, Hammer replied, reaching across the table to scatter the balls with one meaty hand. I'm ready to play now. The sound of the balls clacking against each other and rolling across the floor seemed to echo in the sudden silence. Every conversation in the bar had stopped. Every eye now focused on the confrontation that was building like a storm front. Sheriff Yates stood slowly, his hand resting on his radio. Gentlemen, I think there might be a misunderstanding here. This is a peaceful establishment, and we'd like to keep it that way. Gravel turned to face him, his expression shifting from casual arrogance to something harder, more focused. Sheriff, right? You can tell by the way he carries himself. All that authority, all that responsibility. He stepped closer, close enough that Yates could smell the whiskey on his breath. Tell me, Sheriff, how many deputies you got backing? You up tonight? Enough, Yates replied, though everyone in the room knew he was alone except for Fiona, who was already reaching for her phone. Enough, Gravel repeated, and his crew laughed on cue. I like that. Confident. But confidence without backup is just stupidity wearing a badge. From his corner booth, Steven watched the dynamics unfold with the patience of a man who had learned to read violence the way others read weather patterns. He could see the positioning, the way Stitch had maneuvered to block Mara's escape route, how Wrench had positioned himself between the sheriff and the door, the way Mouse hung back, clearly uncomfortable with the escalation but unwilling to break ranks. Most important, he could see the fear beginning to creep into the civilians' eyes. The kind of fear that came from realizing that the rules they'd lived by their entire lives might not apply to the men who'd just walked into their sanctuary. You know what I think? Gravel continued, his voice growing louder, more theatrical. I think this whole place is stuck in the past. Old woman running an old bar, serving old people who tell old stories about the good old days. He turned to face Lillian, who stood behind the bar with her chin raised and her eyes steady. What do you think, Grandma? You think it's time this place joined the 21st century? I think, Lillian said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned her place through decades of service and sacrifice, that you're welcome to drink your whiskey and be on your way. But you're not welcome to terrorize my customers. The silence that followed was electric with tension. Gravel's face darkened, and for a moment, Steven thought he saw the man's true nature, not just crude and threatening, but genuinely dangerous. Terrorize? Gravel said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than his previous bluster. Lady, you don't know what terror looks like, but you're about to learn. He reached across the bar, his hand closing around Lillian's wrist with enough force to make her wince. See, the thing about old places like this is that they burn real easy. And old people like you, they break even easier. That's when Shadow made his move. The Black Labrador had been watching from his spot by the fireplace, his growl building. Steadily. Now he lunged forward, not to attack, but to place himself between Gravel and his mistress, his teeth bared and his hackles raised. Get that mutt away from me, Gravel snarled, his other hand moving to his belt where a knife handle protruded. Shadow, no, Lillian commanded, but her voice carried more fear for her dog than for herself. Maybe we should all just calm down, Mouse said, his voice cracking slightly. It was the first time he'd spoken since entering the bar, and his words carried the weight of someone who was seeing more than he'd bargained for. Gravel whirled on him, his face twisted with rage. You got something to say, Mouse? You think you're in charge here? I just think you think. You don't think. You do what I tell you to do. Gravel's attention snapped back to Lillian, and with one savage motion, he shoved her backward into the liquor shelf behind the bar. The crash of breaking glass filled the air as bottles shattered against the floor and wall. Lillian stumbled, her hand going to her cheek where a piece of glass had opened a thin cut that began to bleed immediately. The room erupted in shocked exclamations and half-formed protests, but it was Mara who moved first, rushing to her aunt's side. "Lillian, I'm all right," Lillian said, but her voice was shaky, and the blood on her cheek told a different story. "You son of a bitch," Ty Green said, struggling to his feet despite his wooden leg. "You want to fight someone? Fight me." "Sit down, old man," Stitch said, shoving Ty back into his chair with casual violence. "Before you get hurt." The transformation in the room was complete. What had been a sanctuary, a place of community and safety, had become a hunting ground. The bikers had established their dominance through casual cruelty, and everyone understood that this was just the beginning. Everyone except Steven Seagal. In his corner booth, he set down his mug of green tea with the kind of deliberate care that suggested ritual. His eyes, which had been taking in every detail of the confrontation, now fixed on Gravel with laser focus. For 6 months, Steven had been running from the ghosts of Jakarta, from the memory of orders given and lives lost, from the weight of violence that had defined his existence for too many years. He'd come to Cinder Hollow seeking peace, seeking a place where he could simply be anonymous, where his past wouldn't follow him. But watching Lillian's blood run down her cheek, seeing the fear in Mara's eyes, hearing the tremor in an old man's voice as he tried to defend a woman who had become the heart of this community, Steven realized that some things were worth fighting for. Some things were worth breaking his retirement for. He stood up. The moment Steven Seagal rose from his booth, the entire atmosphere of the Hollow taproom shifted. It wasn't dramatic. No chair scraping, no sudden movement. He simply unfolded from his seat with the fluid grace of water finding its level, and somehow that quiet motion commanded more attention than all of Gravel's bluster. Well, Gravel said, turning to face this new development. "Look what we got here. The strong, silent type wants to play hero." Steven said nothing. He stood beside his booth, hands relaxed at his sides, his breathing steady and controlled. To most observers, he looked calm to the point of being almost serene. But Mara, who had spent 3 months watching him, noticed the subtle changes. The way his weight shifted slightly forward onto the balls of his feet, the way his eyes tracked not just Gravel, but every member of his crew, calculating distances and angles. "You got something to say, old man?" Stitch called out, his hand moving to the knife on his belt. "Or are you just going to stand there looking pretty?" Steven's response was barely above a whisper, but it carried clearly across the silent room. "Let the lady go." Gravel laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "The lady? You mean the old bitch who can't mind her own business?" He reached out and grabbed Lillian's wrist again, this time twisting it just enough to make her gasp. "This lady? She's learning some manners." "Last chance," Steven said, and there was something in his voice now, not louder, but denser, like the air before a thunderstorm. "Last chance for what?" Gravel demanded. "You gonna call the cops? File a complaint? Write a strongly worded letter?" Steven took a step forward, and suddenly the geometry of the room changed. Hammer, who had been lounging against the pool table, straightened up. Wrench's hand moved to his knife. Stitch positioned himself between Steven and the bar, his stance shifting from casual to predatory. "I'm going to give you to the count of 3, Gravel said, his voice carrying the kind of theatrical menace that had intimidated countless victims in countless bars across the country. 1, 2. He never got to 3. Steven moved. Later, when the story was told and retold in the months that followed, people would struggle to describe exactly what they had seen. Ty Green would say it was like watching lightning strike in slow motion. Mara would describe it as water flowing around obstacles, finding the path of least resistance. Sheriff Yates, who had seen his share of violence, would simply say it was the most efficient thing he'd ever witnessed. Steven's first target was Stitch, who had positioned himself as the primary threat with his knife already half-drawn. Steven closed the distance between them in 2 fluid steps, his left hand deflecting Stitch's knife arm, while his right delivered a precise strike to the biker's solar plexus. The knife clattered to the floor as Stitch doubled over, gasping for air that wouldn't come. Before Stitch had even begun to fall, Steven was already moving toward Hammer, who was reaching for what looked like a sawed-off pool cue. Steven's hand closed around Hammer's wrist, and with a motion that looked almost gentle, he redirected the man's momentum, using his own strength against him. Hammer went down hard, his head connecting with the edge of the pool table with a sound like a melon hitting pavement. Wrench had his knife out now, a wicked-looking blade that caught the light as he lunged forward. But Steven was no longer where he had been. He sidestepped the attack, his hand closing around Wrench's wrist in a grip that made the man's fingers spasm open. The knife fell, and Steven's other hand found the pressure point at the base of Wrench's neck. The biker's eyes rolled back, and he collapsed like a marionette with its strings cut. The entire sequence had taken perhaps 10 seconds. Gravel still had his hand on Lillian's wrist, but his confident smirk had vanished. What the hell? Steven turned toward him, and for the first time, Gravel saw something that made his blood run cold. The man's eyes were completely calm, but they held the kind of depth that came from having stared into the abyss and emerged intact. This wasn't just some tough guy playing hero. This was a predator, and Gravel suddenly realized he had walked into the wrong territory. Let her go, Steven said again, his voice carrying the same quiet authority as before. Gravel's hand tightened on Lillian's wrist, but Steven could see the uncertainty in his eyes, the way his gaze darted toward his fallen crew members. You think you're some kind of badass? He said, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. You think you can just… Steven took another step forward, and Gravel's words died in his throat. The biker was a big man, used to using his size and reputation to intimidate others. But standing 3 feet away from Steven Seagal, he felt like a child playing at being tough. I won't ask again, Steven said. Gravel's grip loosened, and Lillian pulled her wrist free, stepping back behind the bar where Mara immediately moved. To shield her, Shadow, who had been growling throughout the confrontation, positioned himself between the women and the bikers, his dark eyes fixed on Gravel. You made a mistake, Gravel said, trying to reclaim some of his lost authority. You have no idea who you're messing with. The Gravel Fangs don't forget. We don't forgive. Neither do I, Steven replied, and there was something in those 3 words that made Gravel take an involuntary step backward. It was then that Mouse, who had been pressed against the wall throughout the entire confrontation, caught Steven's eye. The young man was pale, his hands shaking slightly, and Steven could see the fear and confusion warring in his expression. This wasn't a hardened criminal. This was a scared kid who had gotten in over his head. Steven looked at him for a long moment, and Mouse seemed to understand something unspoken. He nodded, almost imperceptibly, and then slowly, carefully, began backing toward the door. Where you going, Mouse? Gravel demanded, but his voice cracked slightly. I'm done, Mouse said, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm done with all of this. He reached the door and pushed through it, disappearing into the night. The sound of a motorcycle engine starting up and fading into the distance marked his departure. Gravel turned back to Steven, his face twisted with rage and humiliation. You think you've won something here? You think this is over? It is for tonight, Steven said. As if summoned by his words, the wail of sirens began to build in the distance. Someone, probably Fiona, had called for backup, and the cavalry was finally arriving. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Gravel looked around at his fallen crew members, at the blood on Lillian's cheek, at the faces of the townspeople who were looking at him with a mixture of fear and disgust. The predator's confidence was gone, replaced by the desperate calculation of a cornered animal. This ain't over, he said, but even he seemed to know how hollow the words sounded. Steven didn't reply. He simply stood there, watching, waiting, as calm and still as a mountain lake. The sirens were getting closer now, and red and blue lights began to flicker through the windows of the hollow taproom. The reckoning had arrived, and everyone in the room knew that nothing would ever be quite the same again. The red and blue lights painted the interior of the hollow taproom in harsh, strobing colors as Sheriff Yates and Deputy Quan burst through the front door, weapons drawn. What they found was a scene that would have been impossible to imagine when their shift started that morning. 3 bikers lay unconscious or semi-conscious on the floor, groaning and struggling to focus their eyes. Broken glass littered the area behind the bar, and the smell of spilled whiskey mixed with the metallic scent of blood. Lillian Rhodes sat on a bar stool, a clean dish towel pressed to her cheek. while Mara hovered nearby with a first aid kit. The other patrons, Ty Green, Dave and Pete, and the others, stood pressed against the walls, their faces showing a mixture of shock and awe. And in the center of it all stood Steven Seagal, as calm and composed as if he'd simply been waiting for a bus. What the hell happened here? Sheriff Yates demanded, his weapon still drawn but lowered toward the floor. These gentlemen, Lillian said, her voice steady despite the blood on her cheek, were unhappy with our hospitality. Steven helped them reconsider their position. Fiona moved quickly to check on the fallen bikers, her training as a law enforcement officer kicking in. This one's got a concussion, she reported, kneeling beside Hammer. This one's breathing but unconscious. And this one? She looked at Stitch, who was still curled up on the floor, gasping for air. This one's going to be pissing blood for a week. They attacked Mrs. Rhodes, Mara said, her voice tight with anger. Shoved her into the liquor shelf, cut her face. Steven stepped in to protect her. Yates holstered his weapon and turned to face Steven, his expression unreadable. You want to tell me your version of events? They were threatening the lady, Steven said, his voice carrying the same quiet authority it had throughout the confrontation. I asked them to stop. They chose not to. And you chose to put 3 men in the hospital. I chose to protect innocent people, Steven replied. If that's a crime in your town, Sheriff, maybe you need to reconsider your priorities. The words hung in the air like a challenge, and for a moment, Yates felt the weight of every decision he'd made since becoming sheriff. He looked at Lillian, who had been like a mother to half the town, sitting there with blood on her face because some thugs had decided to terrorize his community. He looked at his neighbors, people he'd sworn to protect, who had been forced to cower in their own sanctuary. Then he looked at Steven Seagal, who had done what Yates himself would have done if he'd been here in time. Fiona, he said, call for ambulances. These men need medical attention before they can be transported. What about him? Fiona nodded toward Gravel, who was still standing but looking significantly less confident than when he'd first walked in. Trey Maddox, Yates said, approaching the biker leader. You're under arrest for assault, battery, destruction of property, and about 6 other charges I'm going to think up on the way to the station. You can't prove anything, Gravel said, but his voice lacked conviction. I've got about 15 witnesses who say otherwise, Yates replied, producing his handcuffs. And one of them is a woman who's been a pillar of this community for 40 years. Whose word do you think a jury's going to believe? As Yates cuffed Gravel, Steven moved to the bar where Mara was still tending to Lillian's cut. He knelt down beside her, his expression softening with concern. Let me see, he said gently, and there was something in his voice that made Lillian lower the dish towel. The cut wasn't deep, but it was still bleeding, and there was already bruising forming around it. Steven examined it with the careful attention of someone who had field medical training. You'll need stitches, he said, but it's not as bad as it looks. I've had worse, Lillian replied, and Steven could see the truth of that in her eyes. This was a woman who had buried her husband, kept a business running through economic downturns, and faced down her share of troublemakers over the years. But there was something else in her expression too, a kind of recognition, as if she was seeing Steven clearly for the first time. Thank you, she said, and the simple words carried more weight than any speech could have. Steven nodded, then stood and stepped back as the EMTs arrived to tend to both Lillian and the fallen bikers. He moved to his corner booth, settling back into his seat as if nothing had happened. Don't get comfortable, Fiona said, approaching him with her notebook out. I need to get your statement. What would you like to know? Let's start with who you are exactly. Because what I just saw. She paused, studying him with the kind of analytical gaze that had made her a good detective in the city. That wasn't just barroom brawling. That was professional. Steven looked at her for a long moment, considering how much to reveal. I had some military training. A long time ago. What kind of training? The kind that teaches you to end fights quickly and efficiently. Fiona wrote something in her notebook, but her expression suggested she wasn't satisfied with the answer. I'm going to need more than that. Why? Steven asked. Am I under arrest? Should you be? It was Sheriff Yates who answered, approaching their table with 2 cups of coffee. No, he said, settling into the booth across from Steven. You're not under arrest. You're not even in trouble. What you are is someone who stepped up when decent people were in danger. He slid one of the coffee cups across the table. But Deputy Kwan is right about one thing. What you did tonight. That wasn't just courage. That was skill. High-level skill. Steven accepted the coffee, but didn't drink it. Sometimes skills find you whether you want them or not. And sometimes, Yates said, a town needs someone with skills like yours. The implication hung in the air between them. Steven had come to Cinder Hollow seeking anonymity, hoping to disappear into the quiet rhythms of small-town life. But tonight had changed that. Tonight had marked him as someone special, someone worth knowing. I'm not looking for trouble, Sheriff, Steven said. I know that. But trouble seems to have found you anyway. Yates leaned forward, his voice dropping to a more confidential tone. Look, I don't know what brought you to our town, and I don't need to know. But what I do know is that you're the kind of man who stands up when good people are in danger. And frankly, that's exactly the kind of person we need more of around here. Across the room, Mara was helping Lillian to her feet, preparing to drive her to the clinic for proper medical attention. As they passed Steven's table, Lillian paused. Steven, she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned the right to speak for the community. You'll always have a place here. Always. After she left, Steven sat in silence. For a moment, staring into his coffee. When he finally looked up, he found Yates watching him with patient eyes. What happens now? Steven asked. Now, Yates said, we clean up this mess, process these criminals, and try to make sure something like this doesn't happen again. He paused, studying Steven's face. The question is, are you willing to help us do that? Steven looked around. The bar, taking in the broken glass, the bloodstains, the lingering smell of fear and violence. Then he looked at the faces of the people who were already starting to clean up, to put their sanctuary back together. For the first time in 6 months, he felt like he might have found something worth protecting. We'll see, he said, and Sheriff. Yates decided that was answer enough. For now, the cabin sat in darkness, surrounded by the whisper of pine needles and the distant murmur of Whispering Creek. Steven Seagal stood at the window, watching the first pale light of dawn creep across the Montana sky. He hadn't slept, not because of the violence at the bar, but because of what it had awakened in him. On the kitchen table behind him lay a small wooden elephant, no bigger than his thumb, carved from teak and worn smooth by years of handling. A gift from a child in Jakarta, given to him 3 days before everything went wrong. Before the intel proved faulty. Before the warehouse that was supposed to be empty turned out to be full of families. Before Steven Seagal learned that even the most precise operations could spiral into chaos when human lives hung in the balance. The nightmare had come again, as it had every few weeks for the past 6 months. The sound of automatic weapons fire, echoing through narrow streets. The smell of cordite and fear. The weight of decisions made in fractions of seconds that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Sector 7 is clear, his younger self had said into the radio, watching through night vision as his team prepared to breach the warehouse. No civilian presence detected, but the thermal imaging had been wrong. The intelligence had been wrong. And when the smoke cleared, Steven had found himself standing in a room full of refugees who had been using the building as shelter, their lives ended by an operation he had planned and executed with surgical precision. He'd completed the mission, the weapons cache was destroyed, the terrorist cell eliminated. But the victory had tasted like ash in his mouth, and when he'd returned to Langley, he'd placed his resignation on his handler's desk without a word. The sound of gravel crunching under tires pulled him from his memories. Through the window, he could see Sheriff Yates' patrol car making its way up the narrow dirt road that led to his cabin. Steven wasn't surprised. He'd been expecting this conversation. He stepped onto the porch as Yates climbed out of his vehicle, moving with the careful deliberation of a man who wasn't sure what kind of reception he'd receive. The sheriff looked like he'd been up all night, his uniform rumpled and his eyes showing the strain of processing 5 arrests and dealing with the paperwork that came with a major incident. "Morning, Sheriff," Steven said, his voice carrying across the still air. "Steven." Yates approached the porch, his hands visible and relaxed. "Mind if we talk?" Steven gestured to a pair of Adirondack chairs that the cabin's previous owner had left behind. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the sun climb higher above the tree-line. "Hell of a thing last night," Yates said finally. "Yes, it was." Fiona ran background checks on those bikers. Turns out they've got connections to a larger organization, drug runners, gun smugglers, the works. What happened at Lillian's place was just the tip of the iceberg. Steven nodded, unsurprised. He'd recognized the type, not just thugs looking for easy money, but part of something bigger and more dangerous. The thing is, Yates continued, we're a small department. 2 full-time officers, 3 part-time deputies, and a budget that barely covers our basic needs. When groups like the Gravel Fangs decide to move through our territory, we're outgunned and outmanned. What are you asking me, Sheriff? Yates turned to face him, his expression serious. I'm asking if you'd consider helping us. Not as a deputy. I can't afford to put you on the payroll. But as a consultant. Someone who can help us prepare for what's coming. Steven was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard experience. I've spent 20 years teaching people how to fight, Sheriff. How to kill efficiently and without hesitation. I've planned operations that left good men dead and innocent. People in the crossfire. Is that really the kind of help you want? What I want, Yates said firmly, is someone who understands that there's a difference between necessary violence and senseless brutality. Someone who can end a fight without starting a war. Steven looked at him, seeing not just a rural sheriff, but a man who was trying to protect something precious. The kind of community that Steven had spent his entire adult life defending from the shadows. I came here to get away from all of that, Steven said. I know, but sometimes running away isn't an option. Sometimes you have to stand and fight for what matters. The words hung in the air between them, and Steven felt the weight of a decision that would define the rest of his life. He could say no, maintain his anonymity, and hope that the violence would pass by his adopted home. Or he could accept that some things were worth fighting for, even if it meant confronting the ghosts that haunted him. Before he could answer, another vehicle appeared on the dirt road, Mara's pickup truck, moving fast enough to kick up a cloud of dust. She parked beside the sheriff's car and climbed out, her face showing a mixture of determination and nervousness. I hope I'm not interrupting, she said, approaching the porch. Not at all, Steven replied, rising to offer her his chair. How's Lillian? 16 stitches and a concussion, but she's tough. She'll be fine. Mara settled into the chair, her eyes moving between Steven and the sheriff. I came to thank you, and to ask you something. What's that? Stay, she said simply. I know you came here looking for peace and quiet, but this town needs someone like you. We need someone who won't back down when good people are threatened. Steven looked at her, seeing in her face the same thing he'd seen in Lillian's eyes the night before, recognition. Not just of what he'd done, but of what he represented. A protector, a guardian, someone who stood between the innocent and those who would harm them. The boys have been asking about you, Mara continued. They want to know if you're really a ninja, and if you'll teach them how to fight like you do. Despite everything, Steven found himself smiling. I'm not a ninja, but you'll stay? He looked out at the mountains, at the pristine wilderness. That had drawn him here in the first place. 6 months ago, he'd been looking for a place to disappear, to fade into obscurity and let the world forget about Steven Seagal. But perhaps what he'd really been looking for was a place worth defending. I'll stay, he said, and felt something shift inside him, like a weight being lifted from his shoulders. And Sheriff, yeah, I'll help. But we do this my way. No unnecessary violence. No escalation. We protect the innocent, and we give everyone a chance to walk away. Yates extended his hand, and Steven shook it, sealing an agreement that would change everything. Welcome to the team, the sheriff said. In the distance, the sound of motorcycle engines echoed through the mountains, growing closer. The morning sun was climbing higher when Mara returned to Steven's cabin, this time with a thermos of coffee and a bag of Lillian's homemade biscuits. She found him in the clearing behind the cabin, moving through a series of fluid motions that seemed to blend martial arts with something more meditative. Aikido, she said, settling on a fallen log to watch. Steven completed the form before acknowledging her presence, his movements precise and controlled. You know it. I was married to a Marine for 3 years. He studied different fighting styles. She poured coffee into 2 cups, the steam rising in the cool mountain air. He said Aikido was about using an opponent's energy against them, rather than meeting force with force. Your husband was a wise man. He was, until he decided that Jim Beam was a better companion than his wife and kids. She handed him a cup, her expression matter of fact rather than bitter. But that's ancient history. I didn't come here to talk about my ex. Steven accepted the coffee, studying her face. In the morning light, he could see the strength that had carried her through single motherhood, the intelligence that had made her a good EMT, and something else, a kind of recognition that made him slightly uncomfortable. Why did you come? To bring you breakfast. To thank you again for last night. And to ask you something. She opened the bag of biscuits, the smell of butter and honey filling the air. My boys, Jake and Tommy, they're good kids, but they're growing up in a world that's getting more dangerous every day. They need to know how to protect themselves, but more importantly, they need to know when not to fight. And you think I can teach them that? I think you understand the difference between a warrior and a killer. I think you know that true. Strength isn't about how much damage you can do, but about how much you can prevent. Steven was quiet for a moment, sipping his coffee and watching a hawk circle high above the tree-line. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. I've trained soldiers, Mara. Men and women who needed to learn how to survive in places where survival meant killing or being killed. But what I learned over the years is that the most important lesson isn't about technique or tactics. It's about knowing when to stop. The boys asked me if you were a superhero, she said with a slight smile. I told them you were something better, a good man who knows how to do what's necessary. I'm not sure I deserve that description. We all have things we're not proud of, Steven. The question is what we do with that knowledge. Do we let it destroy us, or do we use it to become better? Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps on the trail leading to the cabin. They turned to see a young man approaching hesitantly, his hands visible and empty. It was Mouse, the youngest of the Gravel Fangs, looking even younger in the morning light. I'm not armed, he called out when he saw Steven tense slightly. I just want to talk. Steven stood, his posture relaxed but alert. Talk about what? About last night. About what I did. About what I didn't do. Mouse came closer, and in the daylight, Steven could see the bruises on his knuckles, the cut on his lip, the general where that came from a life lived on the margins. I wanted to apologize. To both of you. You didn't hurt anyone, Mara said, though her voice carried a note of caution. No, but I didn't stop them either. I stood there and watched while they terrorized your aunt, and I didn't do anything. To help. He looked directly at Steven. When you looked at me last night, I saw something in your eyes. Not anger, not judgment. Just disappointment. Like you knew I could be better. Can you? Steven asked simply. I don't know. I've been running. With gangs since I was 14. It's all I know. But watching what happened last night, seeing what real strength looks like. He paused, struggling with the words. I don't want to be like Gravel. I don't want to be someone who hurts innocent people. Steven studied the young man, seeing past the leather jacket and the tattoos to the frightened kid underneath. What do you want? I want to make things right. I want to help fix what we broke. And I want to learn how to be someone different. The other gang members won't like that, Mara pointed out. They're in jail. And even if they weren't, I'm done with them. I'm done with that life. Mouse reached into his jacket slowly, pulling out a folded piece of paper. I wrote down everything I know about the Gravel Fangs operations. Places they've hit, people they work with, plans they've made. I figured maybe it would help the sheriff. Steven took the paper, scanning its contents. It was detailed, specific, and exactly the kind of intelligence that law enforcement needed to build a case against the organization. This is good information, he said. But information alone doesn't change who you are. That takes work. Daily. Work. I'm willing to work. Are you willing to start at the bottom? To prove yourself through actions rather than words? Mouse nodded eagerly. Yes, sir. Whatever it takes. Steven looked at Mara, who shrugged slightly. Lillian always said everyone deserves a second chance, though she'd probably want to give him a few chores first. The Hollow taproom needs repairs, Steven said. New glass, refinished floors, restocked bar. Are you willing to help with that? Yes, sir. And you understand that this doesn't make you part of our community. Not yet. Trust is earned, not given. I understand. Steven studied the young man for another moment, then nodded. Be at the bar at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. Bring work gloves and a good attitude. And Mouse. Yes, sir? My name is Steven. You'll call me that, or nothing at all. I'm not your commanding officer, and I'm not your father. I'm just a man who believes people can change if they want it badly enough." Mouse smiled, the first genuine expression Steven had seen from him. "Thank you, Steven. I won't let you down." After he left, Mara turned to Steven with a questioning look. "You think he's serious?" "Time will tell. But everyone deserves a chance to prove they can be better than their worst moment. Even you." The question hung in the air between them, and Steven felt the weight of it. He thought about Jakarta, about the decisions that had brought him to this mountain cabin, about the ghosts that haunted his dreams. "Maybe," he said finally, "maybe that's what I'm trying to find out." In the distance, the sound of motorcycle engines echoed through the mountains, but this time they seemed to be moving away rather than approaching. For the moment, at least, the immediate threat had passed. But Steven knew better than to assume the danger was over. Organizations like the Gravel Fangs didn't forget, and they didn't forgive. They would be back, in one form or another. When they came, he would be ready. The call came at 3:47 a.m., jerking Sheriff Yates from a sleep that had been fitful at best. The voice on the other end was Deputy Martinez from the county jail, and the tension in his words was unmistakable. "Sheriff, we've got a problem. That biker we booked yesterday, Gravel Maddox. He made a phone call about an hour ago. Long distance, to someone in Denver. We monitored it per protocol, and, well, you need to hear this." Yates was already reaching for his clothes, the phone cradled against his shoulder. "Play it." The recording was scratchy, but clear enough. Gravel's voice, tight with humiliation and rage. "Duke, it's me. We got problems in Montana. Some ex-military psycho took down my whole crew. Made us look like amateurs in front of the whole town." A deeper voice, gravelly from years of cigarettes and hard living. "You let one man take down 5 of you? This wasn't just some tough guy, Duke. This was a professional. The kind of professional that makes our business very difficult if he decides to stay involved. Where is he now?" "Still in the town. Cinder Hollow." "And Duke?" "The locals are starting to look at him like he's their personal savior. That's bad for business. I'll handle it. You just keep your mouth shut and do your time. I'll be there in 2 days." The line went dead, and Yates felt his stomach drop. He'd heard of Duke Maddox, Gravel's older brother, a man who had turned the Gravel Fangs from a local nuisance into a regional threat. If Duke was coming to Montana, the situation was about to escalate far beyond a simple bar fight. An hour later, Yates sat in his office with Deputy Kwan and Steven Seagal, the recording playing for the 3rd time. Steven's expression hadn't changed throughout the playback. Calm, analytical, already calculating angles and possibilities. "Duke Maddox," Fiona said, consulting her laptop. "Real name David Maddox. Age 45, extensive criminal record going back to juvenile court. He's been building a network of affiliated biker gangs across the Mountain West, using them to move drugs and weapons. FBI has been trying to build a case against him for 3 years. He's not coming here to negotiate," Steven said quietly. "He's coming to send a message. To his own people, to the locals, and to anyone else who might think about standing up to him." "What kind of message?" Yates asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "The kind that involves fire and blood. He'll want to make an example of me, and probably of anyone who helped me. Lillian, Mara, maybe even you." "Sheriff." The weight of that possibility settled over the room like a shroud. Yates had signed up to protect his community, but he'd never imagined facing the kind of organized violence that Duke Maddox represented. "We could call in the state police," Fiona suggested. "Or the FBI. This is clearly beyond our capability. By the time they respond, it'll be too late," Steven said. "Duke won't announce his arrival. He'll hit fast and hard, probably at night when people are vulnerable. So what do we do?" Yates asked. Steven was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on something beyond the office window. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who had planned operations in hostile territory. "We prepare. We warn the people who might be targets. We set up defensive positions. And we hope that when the time comes, we're ready for what's coming. And if we're not..." Steven's eyes met his, and Yates saw something there that was both reassuring and terrifying. The gaze of a man who had faced impossible odds before and survived. "Then we make sure the cost of victory is so high that Duke Maddox regrets ever hearing the name Cinder Hollow." Meanwhile, on a highway outside Denver, four motorcycles roared through the pre-dawn darkness. The leader, A man built like a bear with graying hair and scars that told stories of violence survived, rode with the focused intensity of someone who had never backed down from a fight. Duke Maddox had spent 30 years building his reputation, on the principle that disrespect had consequences. His younger brother had been humiliated, his crew had been defeated, and his organization's credibility had been damaged by one man in a small Montana town. That could not stand. Behind him rode 3 of his most trusted lieutenants, men who had proven themselves in the kind of conflicts that never made the news. They carried enough firepower to level a city block, and they had the experience to use it effectively. But Duke's real weapon wasn't guns or explosives. It was fear. The kind of fear that came from knowing that crossing the Gravel Fangs meant more than just a beating. It meant watching everything you cared about burn to the ground. As the sun rose over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of red and gold, Duke Maddox smiled. He was looking forward to meeting this mysterious defender of Cinder Hollow. He was looking forward to teaching him that some lessons could only be learned in blood. Back in Cinder Hollow, Mouse was already at work at the Hollow taproom, replacing broken glass and refinishing damaged wood. He'd been there since dawn, working with the kind of focused intensity that came from having something to prove. Lillian watched him from behind the bar, her face still showing the bruises from the previous night's violence. But there was something else in her expression, a kind of cautious hope that came from watching someone trying to change their life. "You're a good worker," she said, bringing him a cup of coffee. "Thank you, ma'am. I want to do this right. Steven says you gave the sheriff some useful information." Mouse nodded, his hands never stopping their work. "Everything I could remember. Names, places, operations. Maybe it'll help prevent someone else from getting hurt. And what about you? What prevents you from going back to that life?" Mouse paused, his eyes meeting hers. "You do. All of you. Last night, I saw what it looked like when good people stood up for each other. I want to be part of that. I want to be someone who protects instead of someone who destroys." Lillian studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Well then, I suppose we'll have to teach you how." Neither of them noticed the black sedan that had been parked across the street for the past hour, its occupants watching the bar with the patience of predators waiting for the right moment to strike. The war was coming to Cinder Hollow, and everyone would soon learn that some battles were worth fighting, no matter the cost. The War Council convened at sunset in the back room of the Hollow taproom, away from the curious eyes of the few remaining patrons. Steven had requested the meeting, and the urgency in his voice had convinced everyone to attend. Around the scarred wooden table sat Sheriff Yates, Deputy Quan, Mara, Lillian, Ty Green, and Mouse, an unlikely group of defenders preparing for a battle none of them had wanted. "Duke Maddox will be here tomorrow night," Steven said without preamble. "He's traveling with at least 3 men, possibly more. They'll be heavily armed and operating under the assumption that intimidation and overwhelming force will get them what they want." "Which is?" Mara asked, though her tone suggested she already knew. "Me. Dead or humiliated, preferably both. But he'll go through anyone who tries to protect me, and he'll make sure the lesson is memorable enough that no one else in this region ever thinks about standing up to the Gravel Fangs again." The weight of those words settled over the room, like a funeral shroud. These were good people, honest people, who had never asked to be caught in the middle of a war between organized criminals and a retired operative seeking redemption. "We could evacuate," Fiona suggested. "Close the bar, get people out of town until this blows over." "It won't blow over," Steven replied. "Duke will just wait us out, and then he'll come back when we're not expecting it. The only way to end this is to meet it head on." "You're talking about a fight," Yates said. "A real fight, with real casualties." "I'm talking about defending our home," Steven corrected. "There's a difference." He stood and moved to a large map of the town that he'd tacked to the wall. Red pins marked strategic locations, and blue lines showed potential approaches and escape routes. "The Hollow taproom is the natural target," he continued. "It's where the original confrontation happened, and it's the heart of the community. Duke will want to make his statement here, where it will have the most impact. So we abandon it," Ty said, his wooden leg tapping against the floor. "Find somewhere else to make our stand." "No." The voice was Lillian's, firm and unyielding. "This is my place. My husband's place. We don't give it up without a fight." Steven looked at her, seeing the same steel that had made her stand up to Gravel despite being outnumbered and outgunned. Are you sure, Lillian? Because if we make our stand here, there's no guarantee any of us will walk away. I'm sure, she said. Some things are worth fighting for. Steven nodded, then turned back to the map. In that case, we turn the taproom into a fortress. We know the layout, we know the sight lines, and we know the terrain. Duke will have superior firepower, but we'll have the advantage of preparation and position. What do you need us to do? Mara asked. First, we need to get the non-combatants out of harm's way. Your boys, the elderly, anyone who can't or shouldn't fight. Fiona, can you coordinate evacuation to the community center? Already on it, she replied, making notes. Second, we need to prepare defensive positions. Ty, you know these buildings better than anyone. Where are the strong points? Where can we establish overlapping fields of fire? The old miner leaned forward, his eyes bright with the kind of tactical thinking that had kept him alive through decades of dangerous work. The kitchen has a clear view of the main entrance and the back door. The staircase to the second floor creates a natural choke point, and the basement has a tunnel that connects to the old mining office next door. Emergency exit if we need it. Good. Mouse, you know Duke's tactics. How will he approach this? The young man had been quiet throughout the discussion, but now he spoke with the confidence of someone who had seen the Gravel Fangs in action. He'll want to make a show of it. Probably come in loud and fast, expecting us to panic and scatter. But if we don't, if we fight back effectively, he'll adapt. Duke's not stupid. He survived this long by being flexible. Then we need to be more flexible, Steven said. We need to be ready for whatever he throws at us. I want to do this right. Steven says you gave the sheriff some useful information. Mouse nodded, his hands never stopping their work. Everything I could remember. Names, places, operations. Maybe it'll help prevent someone else from getting hurt. And what about you? What prevents you from going back to that life? Mouse paused, his eyes meeting hers. You do. All of you. Last night, I saw what it looked like when good people stood up for each other. I want to be part of that. I want to be someone who protects instead of someone who destroys. Lillian studied him for a moment, then nodded. Well then, I suppose. We'll have to teach you how. Neither of them noticed the black sedan that had been parked across the street for the past hour, its occupants watching the bar with the patience of predators waiting for the right moment to strike. The war was coming to Cinder Hollow, and everyone would soon learn that some battles were worth fighting, no matter the cost. The War Council convened at sunset in the back room of the Hollow taproom, away from the curious eyes of the few remaining patrons. Steven had requested the meeting, and the urgency in his voice had convinced everyone to attend. Around the scarred wooden table sat Sheriff Yates, Deputy Quan, Mara, Lillian, Ty Green, and Mouse, an unlikely group of defenders preparing for a battle none of them had wanted. Duke Maddox will be here tomorrow night, Steven said without preamble. He's traveling, with at least 3 men, possibly more. They'll be heavily armed and operating under the assumption that intimidation and overwhelming force will get them what they want. Which is? Mara asked, though her tone suggested she already knew. Me. Dead or humiliated, preferably both. But he'll go through anyone who tries to protect me, and he'll make sure the lesson is memorable enough that no one else in this region ever thinks about standing up to the Gravel Fangs again. The weight of those words settled over the room, like a funeral shroud. These were good people, honest people, who had never asked to be caught in the middle of a war between organized criminals and a retired operative seeking redemption. We could evacuate, Fiona suggested. Close the bar, get people out of town until this blows over. It won't blow over, Steven replied. Duke will just wait us out, and then he'll come back when we're not expecting it. The only way to end this is to meet it head on. You're talking about a fight, Yates said. A real fight, with real casualties. I'm talking about defending our home, Steven corrected. There's a difference. He stood and moved to a large map of the town that he'd tacked to the wall. Red pins marked strategic locations, and blue lines showed potential approaches and escape routes. The Hollow taproom is the natural target, he continued. It's where the original confrontation happened, and it's the heart of the community. Duke will want to make his statement here, where it will have the most impact. So we abandon it, Ty said, his wooden leg tapping against the floor. Find somewhere else to make our stand. No. The voice was Lillian's, firm and unyielding. "This is my place. My husband's place. We don't give it up without a fight." Steven looked at her, seeing the same steel that had made her stand up to Gravel despite being outnumbered and outgunned. "Are you sure, Lillian? Because if we make our stand here, there's no guarantee any of us will walk away." "I'm sure," she said. "Some things are worth fighting for." Steven nodded, then turned back to the map. "In that case, we turn the taproom into a fortress. We know the layout, we know the sight lines, and we know the terrain. Duke will have superior firepower, but we'll have the advantage of preparation and position." "What do you need us to do?" Mara asked. "First, we need to get the non-combatants out of harm's way. Your boys, the elderly, anyone who can't or shouldn't fight. Fiona, can you coordinate evacuation to the community center?" "Already on it," she replied, making notes. "Second, we need to prepare defensive positions. Ty, you know these buildings better than anyone. Where are the strong points? Where can we establish overlapping fields of fire?" The old miner leaned forward, his eyes bright with the kind of tactical thinking that had kept him alive through decades of dangerous work. "The kitchen has a clear view of the main entrance and the back door. The staircase to the second floor creates a natural choke point. And the basement has a tunnel that connects to the old mining office next door. Emergency exit if we need it." "Good. Mouse, you know Duke's tactics. How will he approach this?" The young man had been quiet throughout the discussion, but now he spoke with the confidence of someone who had seen the Gravel Fangs in action. "He'll want to make a show of it. Probably come in loud and fast, expecting us to panic and scatter. But if we don't, if we fight back effectively, he'll adapt. Duke's not stupid. He survived this long by being flexible. Then we need to be more flexible," Steven said. "We need to be ready for whatever he throws at us." The planning continued for another hour, with Steven sketching out defensive positions, escape routes, and communication protocols. He moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done this before, in places where the stakes were measured, in nations rather than neighborhoods. But as the meeting broke up and people began to disperse to their assignments, Mara lingered behind. "Steven," she said when they were alone, "there's something I need to say." He turned to face her, seeing something in her expression that made him pause. "I know what you're doing," she continued. "You're preparing to die for us. To sacrifice yourself so that Duke gets what he wants and leaves the rest of us alone." "Mara, don't." She stepped closer, her eyes fierce with emotion. "Don't you dare try to be noble about this. We need you alive. This community needs you alive. My boys need you alive. Your boys need their mother more than they need me. They need both. They need to see that good men don't run when evil comes calling. They need to see that some things are worth fighting for, even when the odds are against you." Steven looked at her, seeing not just the single mother or the former EMT, but the woman who had chosen to stand with him against impossible odds. "I won't lie to you, Mara. Tomorrow night, people might die. Good people. People who don't deserve to be caught up in this. Then we better make sure their sacrifice means something." She moved closer, close enough that he could smell her perfume, could see the determination in her eyes. "Promise me something, Steven. Promise me you'll fight to win, not just to make a point. Promise me you'll come home." Before he could answer, she kissed him, not the desperate kiss of someone saying goodbye, but the fierce kiss of someone claiming what was theirs. When she pulled away, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Promise me," she whispered. "I promise," he said, and meant it. Outside, the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. In the distance, the sound of motorcycle engines echoed through the valley, growing steadily closer. The war was coming to Cinder Hollow, and everyone would soon learn that some battles were worth fighting, no matter the cost. But for the first time in months, Steven Seagal felt something he hadn't experienced since Jakarta: hope. Not just for survival, but for something more. For a future worth fighting for. For a home worth defending. The roar of Harley-Davidson engines shattered the mountain stillness like thunder rolling through a valley. Duke Maddox led his crew down Main Street with the confidence of a man who'd never met resistance he couldn't crush. Behind him rode 3 lieutenants: Viper, Tank, and Bone, each carrying the scars and swagger of men who'd made violence their profession. Inside the hollow taproom, Steven Seagal stood behind the bar, his movements deliberate as he adjusted the placement of pool cues and chairs. Every object had become a potential weapon in his hands. The bar had been transformed into a fortress of community will. "You sure about this, Steven?" Sheriff Yates asked, checking his sidearm one final time. "We could still evacuate. Call in state troopers." Steven's dark eyes remained fixed on the window, watching the headlights approach. "Sometimes you have to stand where you are, Sheriff. This is where we make our stand." Deputy Fiona Kwan positioned herself behind the corner booth, her radio crackling with distant chatter. Mouse Tucker crouched near the kitchen door, his young face tight with determination. He'd chosen his side, and there was no going back. Mara Holt moved to Steven's left, her hands steady despite the tremor in her voice. "My boys asked me to tell you something," she said quietly. "They said to kick ass like a ninja." For the first time in months, Steven almost smiled. Lillian Rhodes stood at the center of it all, Henry's marine rifle cradled in her arms like she was born to it. Her silver hair caught the lamplight, and her eyes held the steel of a woman who'd already lost everything that mattered and found something worth fighting for again. "They're here," Mouse whispered. The engines cut to silence. Boot falls on. Gravel. The creak of leather and the clink of chains. Then Duke's voice, booming through the night. "Seagal, you got something that belongs to me." Steven stepped toward the door, his voice carrying with quiet authority. "Your brother made his choice. So did you. My brother's in a cell because of you." Duke's voice cracked with rage. "And this whole goddamn town's going to burn for it." The door exploded inward. Duke filled the frame like a mountain of muscle and fury, his beard wild, his eyes burning, with the promise of violence. Behind him came his crew, spreading out with practiced precision. But this time, they didn't meet sheep. Deputy Kwan's first shot shattered the overhead light, plunging half the bar into shadows. Mara ducked behind the bar as Viper lunged for her, then rose with a pool cue in her hands, using Steven's training to catch the biker across the throat with surgical precision. "That's for touching what isn't yours," she snarled. Mouse proved his worth when Tank cornered Fiona near the jukebox. The youngest former gang member moved with desperate courage, tackling the massive biker around the knees and sending him crashing into the vintage Wurlitzer. The machine's death song was Tank's unconscious groan. "Kid's got backbone," Ty Green called out, wielding a makeshift club with surprising vigor for a man with one leg. But it was Lillian who stopped the room cold. When Bone raised a knife toward Steven's back, she stepped forward, Henry's rifle level at the biker's chest. "Boy," she said with deadly calm, "you don't know who you're messing with. This is my house. These are my people. And you're not welcome." Bone hesitated, seeing death in her eyes.